If you have ever wondered how a whole country talks itself into something, this is the cleanest case there is, and you can see every step of it. Paris, 1920, not the 1920s, 1720. A narrow street called Quincampoix is so packed with people buying and selling one company's shares that a hunchback is said to have rented out his back as a writing desk. Within about 18 months, that share went from roughly 500 livres to roughly 10,000. Then it went to almost nothing, and it took the French state's finances down with it. The man who built it was a Scottish gambler who had been convicted of murder in London and who, at the peak of this, was running France's money. He had also, by then, converted to Catholicism in order to be allowed to hold the job. In the next half hour, I want to show you what he actually built, because it is not the swindle you have been told about. It is stranger and much more useful. Start with the whole, because nothing that follows makes sense without it. Louis XIV died in 1715 after 72 years on the throne and a very long run of very expensive wars. What he left behind was a state debt that contemporaries put at around 2 billion livres against annual revenue that could not come close to servicing it. To put that in proportion, contemporaries reckoned the annual interest alone at something close to the crown's entire ordinary income. I want to be careful with that number. 17th century French public accounts were not audited in any sense you would recognize, and estimates vary. What nobody disputes is the shape. The interest alone was eating the kingdom. The heir was 5 years old. So France was run by a regent, Philippe, Duke of Orleans, and the regent had inherited a problem with only bad answers. He could default outright. Sovereigns did. It destroyed your ability to borrow for a generation. He could debase the coinage, call the same weight of silver a larger number of livres. France had done that repeatedly. It is a default with better manners. He could raise taxes on a population that was already close to what it would bear through a collection system so corrupt that a large share never reached the treasury. Or he could try something that had never been tried at scale in France, and that is the door he went through. Here is the thing to hold on to. Everything that happened next was, at the start, a serious answer to a real problem, not a scheme dressed up as an answer. An answer argued in print years before anyone offered him money to try it. That is what makes it worth 30 minutes. A pure con is boring. You watch the mark and you wince. This is not that. This is a genuine idea, correct in parts, executed by someone with total control and no break, and it is far more instructive than a con because the good version and the ruinous version look identical from the inside for about a year. There was one more thing the regent had, which is easy to miss and which decided everything. He had an old acquaintance, a gambler from Edinburgh who had been telling anyone who would listen that he could fix exactly this. John Law was born in Edinburgh in April 1671. His father was a goldsmith. That is not a decorative detail. In that period, a goldsmith held other people's metal for safekeeping and issued receipts for it, and those receipts began to circulate as money because they were easier to carry than the metal. So Law grew up inside the single most important fact about money, which is that a claim on a thing can do the work of the thing. In 1694, in his 20s, in London, he killed a man named Edward Wilson in a duel in Bloomsbury Square. He was tried, convicted of murder, and sentenced to death. The sentence was reduced, the case was appealed by the dead man's family, and at some point, Law got out of prison and out of the country. How exactly is not clear. The accounts differ, and several of them are the kind of story that improves with retelling. What is certain is that he spent the next 20 years on the continent as a fugitive. He made his living gambling, not badly, very well, and not by luck. He was one of the people in that period who understood odds well enough to run the bank rather than play against it, and he moved between Amsterdam, Venice, Genoa, and Turin doing exactly that. Which means the man in the story spent 2 decades getting rich on a single professional skill, knowing what a bet is actually worth when everyone around the table is guessing. He also studied, Amsterdam in particular, because Amsterdam had the thing he wanted to understand. The Dutch had a public bank, a working credit system, and a stock market, and the Dutch Republic, small, resource poor, recently at war with everyone, was punching so far above its weight that the explanation had to be financial. Amsterdam had turned itself into the warehouse of Europe on borrowed money, and it had done it without a fraction of France's land, population, or army. In 1705, he wrote it up and offered it to Scotland. The pamphlet is called Money and Trade Considered, with a proposal for supplying the nation with money. Scotland said no. He offered versions of the same idea to other courts over the following decade. Everyone said no. And then a 5-year-old inherited France. His old gambling acquaintance became regent, and the one country in Europe desperate enough to try it was also the largest. So before we go any further, I want to tell you what the idea was in plain words, because if you skip this, the rest looks like magic, and it is not magic. Law's argument starts from an observation that was, at the time, close to heresy. Money is not wealth. Money is what lets wealth move. The dominant view then was that a nation's prosperity was roughly the pile of gold and silver it had managed to accumulate. Get more metal in, let less metal out. That is the whole policy. Ships were sent out to bring metal home, exporting it was restricted, and success was counted in bullion rather than in what anyone produced. Law said that gets it backwards. Look at what actually limits a country, he said. It is not that there is no work to do or nobody to do it. There are fields that could be planted, ships that could sail, people standing idle. What is missing is the thing that lets a transaction happen at all. If you have too little money in circulation, real activity does not happen. Not because it is uneconomic, but because there is no medium to carry it. Trade falls to barter, and barter is slow and thin. And here is the move. If the constraint is the quantity of the medium, and the medium happens to be dug out of the ground in Peru, then your economy's ceiling is set by mining accidents on another continent. That, he said, is insane. Why would you let the size of your economy be decided by how much of one soft yellow metal exists? His answer: issue paper. Not paper standing for metal you are holding. Paper backed by something that actually produces land, revenue, a going concern. Land in particular. Land does not move, it does not run out, and a country has a fixed and knowable quantity of it. And then let the quantity of money expand as trade expands instead of the other way round. I want to be extremely clear about something here because it is the most surprising fact in this episode. That is not a crank position. That is, in broad outline, how money works in every developed country on earth today. Every note in your pocket is a claim on nothing physical. Law was roughly 200 years early, and Joseph Schumpeter, no soft touch, later wrote that law ranked in the very first rank of monetary theorists of all time. So the question this episode is really asking is not, was he a fool? He was not. The question is what happens when a person who is right about the mechanism gets unlimited control of it. May 1716, Law gets his charter. The Banque Generale. It is a private bank, capitalized partly by Law himself, and it does something no French institution had done. It issues notes. And the notes have a feature that sounds tiny and is not. They are payable in coin of the weight at the date of issue. Remember that the crown had a long habit of quietly redefining what a livre was worth. If you held coin, the king could shrink your savings by decree overnight. Law's notes were immune to that. So for the first time, French merchants had an instrument the government could not devalue underneath them. The livre could be redefined at will. This paper could not be, because the promise was written in weight rather than in name. They preferred it to gold. Read that again. Within 2 years, paper from a private bank was trading at a premium to metal in France, because the paper was more honest than the coin. And it worked, genuinely worked. Trade picked up, tax receipts improved, partly because the regent had ordered that taxes be payable in these notes. Bills were discounted, branches opened in Lyon, La Rochelle, Tours, Amiens, and Orléans. This is the part everybody skips because it is boring, and it is the part that was actually working. If the story stopped in 1718, John Law is a hero of economic history, and there is no episode. In December 1718, the bank is nationalized. It becomes the Banque Royale. The king now guarantees the notes. This looks like a promotion, and it is the single most damaging thing that happens in this story. Because the discipline in the first version was that Law's own money was at risk, and a private bank that overissues gets run on and dies. A private banker who prints too much is destroyed by his own customers within weeks and knows it every morning. A royal bank does not get run on in the same way, and the person who decides how many notes to print is now the same person who needs the notes printed. Almost immediately, the guarantee of fixed coin weight is dropped, and the volume of issues starts being decided by what the state needs rather than by what trade requires. Nobody voted for that change. It arrived inside a promotion, which is generally how the important ones arrive. The break came off in 1718. Nobody noticed for 2 years because the car was going downhill and it felt like acceleration. Now the second half of the machine, and this is where it becomes the story you have heard. August 1717. Law is granted the Compagnie d'Occident, the Company of the West, with a monopoly on trade with the French territory of Louisiana. Louisiana at that point is not a state. It is a claim running up the Mississippi across roughly a third of what is now the United States, and it contains, in French terms, almost nothing. A few hundred settlers, some forts, no developed mines. New Orleans is founded the following year and named after the regent. What it does contain in the imagination of a Parisian who has never crossed an ocean is everything. Gold, silver, tobacco, endless land. And the marketing was not subtle. Prints circulated showing mountains and mines and cooperative locals. Settlers were recruited, and a good number of them were recruited out of prisons. Beggars were rounded up in Paris and shipped. Some couples were married at the dockside and sent as settlers on the same afternoon. Of the people shipped out there in these years, a large proportion died of disease, of hunger, of the simple fact that the place being advertised did not exist. That is the part of the story with actual bodies in it, and it tends to get lost behind the share price, so I am putting it here rather than in a footnote. Now watch what Law does with the company over the next 2 years, because the speed is the point. 1719. It absorbs the Company of the East Indies and the China Company. It becomes the Compagnie des Indes, every French overseas trade route in one entity. It acquires the tobacco monopoly. It acquires the right to mint the coinage. And then it acquires the ferme générale, the contract to collect France's indirect taxes. Stop and look at what that is. A single company now holds the nation's foreign trade, its currency production, and its tax collection. And its shares are sold to the public. No modern state would permit any one of those three in private hands, let alone all three, and the reason is exactly what happens next. And then, in August 1719, Law makes the offer that ties the two halves of the machine together. The company will take over the entire royal debt, all of it. Here is the mechanism, and it is worth being slow about because everything after this is a consequence of it. This is the pivot of the entire story, and it is the part that is genuinely clever rather than merely reckless. If you are holding a government annuity, a piece of the national debt, paying a low and unreliable return, you may exchange it for shares in the company. The state's obligation to you is extinguished. The company now owes you instead, and what it owes you is a share of the profits from Louisiana, the Indies, tobacco, the mint, and the taxes. You have swapped a bad, certain claim for a wonderful, uncertain one, and on the day you swap it, feels like a gift. In one move, an unpayable debt has been converted into equity in a story about the future. And the state is delighted because it no longer has an interest bill it cannot meet. There is only one requirement for this to work. The share price must go up. Because if it falls, nobody exchanges and the debt comes straight back. So the share price went up, and it went up in a way France had never seen because France had never had a stock market before. The trading happened in the Rue Quincampoix, a narrow street in central Paris, and the accounts of it read like a festival. Crowds from dawn, gates at either end closed at night, rents in the street reportedly rising to many times what the buildings had been worth a year earlier. coachmen, cooks, and servants dealing alongside dukes. There are contemporary stories of a servant sent to sell at a price, finding a higher one and pocketing the difference. Some of those stories are almost certainly polished, but they were told at the time, and what they record accurately is the texture of it. The ordinary social order stopped applying inside that street. What is beyond dispute is that the street had to be closed at night by order, and that the price of standing in it was itself traded. The price, in round numbers, shares issued around 500 livres. By the autumn of 1719, several thousand. By around December, roughly 10,000. Sources disagree on the exact peak and on exactly when it happened, and anyone who gives you a figure to the nearest livre is inventing precision. About 20-fold in under 2 years is the honest version. It is usually said that the word millionaire enters the language here, coined in French for the people this street produced. I would not swear to that etymology. It is repeated everywhere and it is hard to nail down. What I will say is that the concept needed a word around then, and that is not nothing. And now watch the feedback loop, because this is the whole episode in one paragraph. You could buy the shares on installment, a fraction down, the rest owed later, and you could borrow the fraction from Law's bank, which meant the bank was lending you the money to buy the asset whose price was the reason the bank's notes were trusted. The bank made the money bought the shares, the rising shares justified the bank. 3 things, each holding up the other 2 and nothing at all touching the ground. In January 1720, John Law was appointed Controller General of Finances. A. Scott, a convicted murderer, a professional gambler, in charge of the finances of the largest kingdom in Western Europe. He had to convert to Catholicism to hold the office, and he did. At that moment, one man personally controlled the currency, the national debt, the tax collection, the overseas trade, and the Central Bank of France. There has never been anything quite like it before or since in a major economy, and it lasted about 5 months. Because underneath the street party, the arithmetic had already lost. Here is the problem Law could not solve, and it is the problem at the center of most manias. The shares were now valued at a level that required Louisiana to produce profits Louisiana was never going to produce. Not unlikely to, was not going to. There were no silver mountains. The colony was a few thousand people on a hard piece of coast. The tobacco was real and the trade routes were real, but neither was earning anything remotely like what the shares now implied. So the dividend that the share price implied could not come out of the business. It had to come out of somewhere else, and the only somewhere else was new money. And Law had a bank that could make new money by printing it, and he was in charge of the bank. So he printed. Through 1719 and into 1720, the note issue expanded enormously. Contemporaries and later historians put the increase in the money supply at a multiple of what had existed before. Estimates vary and the records are poor, but every serious account has the note issue ending up far beyond anything the coin reserve could answer. Each time the share price wobbled, the bank supported it. New notes, sometimes issued specifically so that the company could buy its own shares at a floor price, Law announced. I want you to notice what that is, because it has a modern name and it is not a compliment. The issuer of the currency was operating a price support for security, using currency it created for the purpose. It is the issuer of the money buying the asset to protect the price of the asset in order to protect the money. And it works. It genuinely works for a while. That is the trap. It works right up until the moment people start converting the paper into something the printer cannot make, which is what began happening in the winter of 1719 into 1720, quietly, among people who were paying attention. The most famous of them is the Prince de Conti, who is said to have sent wagons to the bank to convert his notes into coin and hauled it away in public view. Whether that is precisely how it happened, the pattern is well recorded. Large holders began to take metal out and move it out of the country. And here's the arithmetic that ends every story of this shape. There were vastly more notes in existence than there was coin in the vault. Not slightly more, multiples more, which is fine, permanently fine, as long as not many people ask at once. This is not a subtle point, and it was not a secret. Everybody involved knew the ratio. It simply did not matter until it did. It is fine the way a theater with one exit is fine. The building works perfectly until the moment everyone wants out simultaneously, and then the design of the building is the whole story. Inflation arrived, as it must when money multiplies and goods do not. Prices in Paris rose steeply through 1719 and into 1720. So the same paper that had bought a fortune in shares now bought less bread than it had the year before, and people could feel that in their hands before any economist explained it to them. February 1720. The response is force. A decree effectively forbids private persons from holding significant quantities of gold and silver and restricts jewelry and plate. Informers are rewarded. Houses are searched. Think about what that decree admits. It says the paper cannot compete with the metal on the merits, so the metal is now illegal. That is the moment the thing stops being a monetary experiment and becomes something you enforce. It does not hold. Metal leaves the country. The share price sags. The bank keeps printing to hold it up, which makes the paper worse, which makes people want metal more. And then, on the 21st of May, 1720, comes the decree that ends it. It orders a staged reduction in the official value of both the shares and the banknotes, cutting them down over several months towards roughly half. Read that plainly. The government announced in writing that the money in your hand and the shares in your drawer would be worth half as much by the autumn by order. It was an attempt at a controlled deflation, and as economics, it is not indefensible. As politics, it was suicide. The intention was to let the air out slowly, rather than all at once, which is what a modern central bank would at least consider. The reaction was immediate, and it was furious, and within about a week, the decree was reversed, which was worse, because now the state had demonstrated two things in 7 days: that it would cut the value of your money by decree, and that it would panic and reverse itself under pressure. After that, nothing anyone announced was believed, and a currency that is not believed is not a currency, it is paper. Law was dismissed from office at the end of May. He was briefly placed under guard, partly, it seems, for his own safety. Crowds gathered at the bank to convert notes. In July, there was a crush outside the bank in which people were killed, and bodies were reportedly carried to the Palais Royal to be shown to the regent. The exact toll is disputed. The fact of it is not, and neither is the fact that the crowd carried the dead to be looked at. The company's privileges were stripped through the autumn. The bank stopped paying. The notes were eventually voided. In December 1720, John Law left France. He left almost everything behind, including a great deal of French land he had bought at the top. That detail matters for the fraud question, and we will come back to it. He did not get out with the money. He was holding the bag, too. A commission was set up to sort through the wreckage. The visa, which examined claims, canceled many, and reduced others. Fortunes made on paper were unwound. Some people who had sold near the top and converted to land or metal kept a great deal. Richard Cantillon, who understood the mechanism as well as Law, is the standard example. He sold early, lent to buyers, and left with a fortune, which is the ugly distributional truth of the whole affair. It was not a general loss. It was an enormous transfer from people who were late to people who were early, with the state absorbing what was left. Law went to Venice. He gambled for a living again. He died there in March 1729, poor. His epitaph, written by a contemporary, called him the celebrated Scot, that calculator without equal, who by the rules of algebra sent France to the poorhouse. Now the consequences, because they are the reason this is not just an anecdote about a silly street. The debt did not disappear. It was reshuffled and partly repudiated through the visa, which is a default wearing a procedural hat. But the deeper damage was to an idea. France came out of 1720 with a national conviction that paper money and joint stock banking were a confidence trick. The word bank itself became suspect. For a long stretch afterwards, France avoided naming institutions that way. And that mattered enormously, because across the channel, the other country that had its own bubble in the same year did not draw the same conclusion. England had the South Sea bubble in 1720. We did that in episode 2 of this series. England's crash was severe. But England kept the Bank of England, kept its credit system, and went on to finance a century of expansion with it. France, having been burned worse, backed away from the tool entirely and spent the rest of the century financing itself through tax farms, venal offices, and short-term borrowing at punishing rates. Historians argue about how far you can run that thread forward. I am not going to tell you that John Law caused the French Revolution. That is too neat, and the evidence will not carry it. What is defensible is narrower and still striking. France entered the 1780s with a fiscal system that could not raise what it needed, and one reason the obvious modern instruments were unavailable is that the country had decided in 1720 that it did not trust them. When the state finally had to raise money in a hurry in 1788, the instruments a modern treasury would reach for were not there to reach for. There is one other thing left over, and it is on the map. New Orleans exists. It was founded in 1718 by this company as a piece of the marketing. The bubble was mostly a fiction. The city is not. That is a strange thing to sit with, and it is true of more bubbles than you would expect. So, this is a series called The Great Frauds. Was it one? Here is the case that it was. The Louisiana prospectus was a lie, and it was known to be a lie by people who had been there. The share price was supported with money the supporter created. Insiders got out first. And here is the case that it was not. Law put his own fortune in and did not take it out. He bought French land at the top and lost it. He kept buying his own shares when a swindler sells. A swindler's plan has an exit. There is no evidence Law ever had one, and quite a lot of evidence that he believed the thing until it fell on him. My honest reading, and you are free to disagree, is that this is the third category, and it is the most common one. Not a con, not an accident. A person who was genuinely right about something important, who was given enough power to remove every mechanism that would have told him when he had gone too far. Every one of the checks that would have stopped him earlier had been handed to him personally, one at a time, as a reward for the previous success. And who then interpreted the absence of bad news as evidence that there was none. That is a far more dangerous animal than a crook, because a crook can be caught. This one gets applauded until the day it stops. 4 things you can take out of 1720 and use on anything in front of you now. None of them is about France. 1. Ask who is buying and with what money. A price is only information when the buyers are independent of the seller. The moment the entity that benefits from a high price is also the entity supplying the money that buys at that price, the number on the screen has stopped being a measurement and become an advertisement. That is the single question that would have flagged Rue Quincampoix in 1719, and it takes about 10 seconds to ask. 2. Watch for the moment force replaces persuasion. February 1720 is the tell in this story. When something must be propped up by making the alternative illegal, or unavailable, or socially unacceptable to mention, the argument has already been lost by whoever is doing the propping. 3. Separate the idea from the size of the bet on it. Law was right about paper money. He was right about credit. Being right is what let him get big enough to do real damage, and at no point did being right protect anyone. The quality of the reasoning and the survivability of the position are 2 different questions, and people who are very good at the first one routinely forget to ask the second. 4. Notice when the break is removed and write down the date. Nothing visible happened in December 1718 when a private bank became a royal one. No price moved. But that is the day the thing that would have stopped this stopped existing, and everything afterwards was already decided. Next Saturday, the Great Frauds moves forward 280 years into something with an audit trail. WorldCom, $11 billion, ordinary expenses filed as if they were investments, and an internal auditor working at night to prove it. I am Masha. Thank you for the half hour, and if you want the long version to keep existing, the follow button is the thing that says so.